Hello and welcome back to my channel, and welcome back to welcome back to part 2 of my lockdown wrap up. So this time I'm going to be talking about the contemporaries that I read over the last 3 months. Again, I'm going to try and do about 10 of them. I can't review all of the 45 books that I read this month because that is just, it's too many. So I've kind of broken it down. If you haven't seen my full list, then it is in part 1 along with the fantasy books that I read. This is going to be part 2 with the contemporary, and then part 3 is going to be the miscellaneous 10 of the just random books that I read during lockdown, because there were some weird ones, but for another time. So I want to start with Stay With Me by Adebayo. I think it's Nigeria set in like the 80s or the 90s. So Stay With Me is about a young woman who is desperate for a baby, and her entire adult life she cannot work out why she can't have a baby. I have polycystic ovarian syndrome, so there are loads of different symptoms to that, and in some people it is curable. For me, at the moment, it isn't. I can take medication that actually would make me physically feel worse, or I can just deal with the fact that it makes me infertile at the moment. That's probably an overshare, but essentially going into this story, I was going in as someone who A, doesn't really want children, and B, can't have children anyway. So it was quite an interesting, like, to hear from a different perspective of someone who is desperate for children and can't have children. It was quite an emotional read, and I think if you're a mum or a young mum or you want to have children, that's going to make it even harder to read for you because it is just so emotionally fraught. The trigger warnings there is obviously infertility, but there is also like baby death. There is several deaths of children. There is sickness. It's a real sad story. But actually it has quite a happy and well resolved ending. I listened to it as an audiobook over a weekend. The reason I picked it up was there was a readathon going on, I think in August, called Diversify Your Shelf, and essentially you would just read books that were specifically by authors of colour, and then one of the prompts in particular was to pick a book by an author of colour at random, and it was in the Audible 2-for-1 sale. I hadn't heard of it before, but obviously being set in Nigeria and written by a Nigerian author, or at least I believe she's Nigerian, I knew that ticked that box. And I really didn't know what to expect, and I would not recommend doing that if you are someone who is triggered by things like that. Thankfully I'm not. Like, it was sad, but I wasn't triggered by it. It was a really sad read, and I was just thankful that it had a happy ending. I don't know anyone else who's read it. Like, I'm literally I keep scouring Twitter looking for people who even remotely mention it, because I feel like I need to talk about it with someone, but I don't know anyone else who's read it. So if you do know someone who's read it and you've read it, please let me know, because I need to talk about it. I'm still not over it. Like, it was a brutal story. What made it worse is I also read 1,000 Splendid Suns, which is a very similar story, but obviously set in Afghanistan. And this is about a young girl who gets married very young. Her family don't really want her, and it just gets sadder and sadder. And again, I picked this up knowing it's going to be sad. Do you remember back in April when I said I wasn't going to read sad stories anymore? Well, apparently I'm a liar. This was gifted to me by an ex-teacher colleague friend of mine. No, I'm the ex-teacher. He's an ex-colleague and he's a friend of mine. But back when we were at school together, because we study The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, and I really enjoy Khaled Hosseini's style of writing. There's a lot in everything. Every chapter has so many layers and you can really break down everything, but they are always so goddamn sad. So this and Stay With Me really threatened to break me. They were both very sad stories, but I both rated them quite high because they made me feel things. If you need to feel things, my recommendation to you, I guess. Let's keep on the trend of sad, and then we can move into the happy. So the other sad story that I read is Pig Heart Boy by Mallory Blackman. Now this was part of Believathon. You had to read a book with a disability rep. Now the kid in this, Marlon, has a heart condition, which means that he just can't keep up with his friends, and he needs a heart transplant. And he's offered the opportunity to receive a pig heart instead of a human heart, and it kind of goes through trials and tribulations of going through a procedure like that, but also with animal activists getting involved and the media getting involved and his family getting involved. And it's not necessarily about the science of it, but how he processes that information and how he deals with the people around him and who he keeps close to him and who he has to push away, and dealing with a trauma through comedy when no one else finds the situation funny and things like that. And this was a really sad read, and it doesn't really let up on the sad, because as an adult you understand that there is so much more going on that he doesn't understand. His parents are struggling. The whole thing is really upsetting, and it has a really sad ending. But Mallory Blackman is just out here to, you know, ruin lives. Congratulations, she did it again. Like, I really enjoyed this, but I knew what I was getting myself into because this was a reread. But yeah, apparently I just really wanted to upset myself, so there's that. Right, let's change tack completely. Let's move away from sad stories and talk about The Ladybug Guide to Dating. Now, this was gifted to me like several Christmases ago because I've been single for 100 years. It was just meant to be a joke, but actually there is some really funny stuff in here that if you have been single for a long time and you enjoy being single, this is the kind of book that kind of breaks down dating and relationships in a way that you're like, yes, that's why I'm single. There is someone else out there that understands. It was genuinely very funny. The same guy who wrote this also wrote the How to Cat Guide. That was less funny. That was obviously just someone just shitting on having a cat, and considering I've literally I'm surrounded by little fluff beans all the time, I didn't enjoy that one as much. Oh, I've upset her now because I woke her up. I didn't enjoy that as much. I just didn't find the jokes as funny, but the dating jokes, I just thought they were so spot on for like shitty relationships and bad dates and just trying to get your life together. I found that genuinely really funny. So there's an upswing for us. Okay, so The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. I did this as part audiobook and part paperback. This is about a young girl who witnesses her friend being shot by the police. And I know it was turned into a film, and it is... I would definitely recommend reading the book, because obviously when you're in her head, you can see it from her perspective, you can see how everything is broken down, and how she's processing that information, whereas the film, although is able to show quite a lot of that, I feel like there is always more in the book. And it's a very powerful read, and obviously with all the Black Lives Matter protests, I know that this was getting another upswing with people reading it, or trying to empathise with what's going on. It should be a book you read because you should read it. It has a lot of really powerful moral messages in it that you shouldn't have to ask your friends about, you should know and should have questions about, and you should be able to go out and do the research on it. I actually already had this. This was gifted to me for Christmas, I think last year, and I just hadn't got around to it. I wasn't reading as much last year in general, so it wasn't that I didn't want to pick this up, and it wasn't that I picked this up because of the riots. It just happened to be that I found an audiobook on Scribd, realised that it was still on my shelf and I hadn't read it yet, and just put two and two together. I gave my mom Queenie and Piecing Me Together to read, and I think I'm going to try and get her to read this one as well, because I just think as three books go from three completely different perspectives, I think they're really important reads. This is an important read, and I think more teachers should teach this book, if only for a way to help your students empathise with what's going on at the moment. Speaking of Queenie, I absolutely adored Queenie. I gave Queenie 5 stars. This is about a young black woman living in Brixton, dealing with depression, dealing with relationships, and dealing with being black and the microaggressions that come with being black. And something that I forgot to mention with regards to The Hate You Give and Queenie is it is those moments when you can just feel yourself cringe because you see the white character say something or do something that either you have done yourself in the past or you have seen other people do and thought nothing of because of your privilege, and then understanding how it affects a black person in a way that it could never affect you. That was really insightful, and I love a book that will make me think. This one did try to break my heart with how she was struggling with her family and with her depression. Very powerful read. It keeps getting compared to Bridget Jones, and I don't really see the comparison other than that it's a young woman living in London trying to get her shit together. This, I thought, was just completely outshines Bridget Jones. Please don't make that comparison to me because I just don't see it, but I would definitely recommend this. It's won so many prizes since I've got it. I can't remember, it's Kansas Carty Williams has just recently received another writing prize for it. It's so good. I think this is her debut novel. I think she's written for magazines and newspapers before, but this is her debut novel and it was just fantastic. So I would definitely recommend that one. Out of the ones that I've mentioned so far, this has been my favourite. In fact, actually I should have saved this to the end because this is my favourite contemporary that I've read. Just checking my list, but this is my favourite contemporary I've read. Absolutely loved it. Okay, DNA by Dennis Kelly. It was really interesting because I did this as part of my trying to read as many books in one day as possible, my Speedopoly. And obviously this being a play and only 60 pages long, it was quite an easy read, but I used to teach this, so it was really interesting kind of going back and seeing all my notes and seeing how I broke it down, because on the surface there's not a lot to this play. Essentially, a bunch of kids accidentally kill their friend and then cover it up, and it really dramatically spirals from there. It's a very, very dark, very sad story, but actually there's so much hidden within it and you need to kind of break it down. I don't know that someone reading this for fun would have kind of got the same out of it, and actually I know that that's the case because I have seen people have since added it to their TBRs and read it, having watched the Speedopoly video, and have really disliked it. So I know this isn't for everyone, but I really enjoyed it. And as a contemporary, it's obviously written very modern, it's written for kids. This is the school edition, so the swearing is not as bad as it is in the real thing. But if you want to go and see a modern play about a bunch of kids who are awful, I would definitely recommend this. Even if you're not going to read it, like, watch the play. The play is epic. This one, someone was weird for me because I didn't actually like the main character, like, at all. Everyone around her is going through something, they're going through their own trauma, they're processing stuff, and what I didn't realise is that it's a series. I didn't realise it was part of a series, so I am intrigued to kind of continue on. I thought the artwork was really, really pretty, but I've never cared less about a main character because really, as much as we're seeing everything through her lens, she's not doing anything of interest. It's everyone around her that's kind of going through their stuff, and she is just how we see it, how we process it. So that was quite interesting. It is a really good graphic novel. I need to read more graphic novels because I just absolutely devour them. Mainly because it has quite a satisfying ending. The people who need to be told off get told off, and the people who need to process some hard stuff do eventually do that. But it's about her family and it's about them going up to this lake house every year. But obviously it's a short snippet, so it's only over like 2 weeks that they go. So that was quite fun. And a perfect summer read, because I'm not really a summery person, but this kind of made me feel like I was on holiday even though I wasn't. But realistically, not in a let's escape kind of way, but in you take your baggage with you when you go abroad. So I really appreciated that, and as a contemporary I highly rated it. And then the last contemporary I want to talk about is Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. Got one hair right in the middle of my face. Now, I literally started Clap When You Land yesterday, and it's really interesting how they're already very different. This is about a young girl who is a poet who processes everything she is experiencing through her poetry, and this is a book written in verse because it's her stories. Now, with Clap When You Land, all the poetry is quite similar. It's obviously still written in verse, but it's broken down and kind of chunked up for you to process it as a poem, whereas these are all separate poems, and you can kind of read different poems and have favourites because they're all structurally very different and thematically very different, but obviously you read them in order because it's her story, but you end up with like favourite poems because they resonate with you in a different way. She's dealing with a mother that she's not entirely sure loves her because she grew up wanting to be a nun and then was forced into marriage. She's dealing with a brother who I can't remember if he was bisexual or homosexual. He isn't dealing with that very well and doesn't want to share that with their very, very Christian mother. She's dealing with physical abuse from her mum and the way that she's punished and things like that. And what is essentially the norm for her is incredibly tragic, but not in a we feel sorry for her kind of way. Like, it's how does she process that, how does she grow from that, and how does she actually communicate with her family. Now, this kind of reminded me very much of Piecing Me Together by Renee Watson, which is also about a young girl who is struggling with the outside world and how to process her emotions and not being able to communicate, so she communicates through her collages. With this, it's through her poetry, and it creates this really poignant, beautiful story where you can relate. Even if you have a great relationship with your parents and you've never been hit by your parents and you don't come home scared they're going to be mad at you, is completely irrelevant. You are still able to relate to this character and her strife and empathise because of the beautiful way it's kind of broken down into verse. There's no way you can't empathise with this unless you're a sociopath. So I found it really, really powerful. I thought it was really, really beautiful, and it made me really, really excited to read more of Elizabeth Acevedo's writing, just because she's able to draw that out of very, very simple, very accessible writing. When I say simple quite a lot, I don't necessarily mean that it's stupid, I mean that it's accessible to someone. So like, I've got quite a short attention span. When I was younger, I used to go out of my way to try and find really big words to say what I meant, rather than just using like what's to hand and what's my peers would necessarily understand, because I thought that made me better than them. I thought it made me smarter than them. And you know a good writer is a good writer when they don't feel the need to do that. This is accessible. Everyone can relate to this. It's so beautifully done. But the language isn't florally and pretentious. It's not driving home the fact that you need to be smart to understand this. And I just absolutely loved it. And I'm trying to find now more poetry like this. And I've recently discovered Sabrina Mahfouz, and I'm really enjoying her writing. And I've just started kind of going through T and Tamsin's backlog of poetry based videos, because I have watched her content before, but I'm like really going to town on the poetry side now. So if you know any other stories that are kind of like this, I would love those recommendations. I'd really appreciate that. And that's my contemporary list. So the next one is going to be my miscellaneous, which is poetry and sci-fi and all the other weird things that just didn't fit into either of these two videos, but that I still wanted to talk about. So if you've made it this far and you're going to make it the whole way, like, I really appreciate you. The world is changing, and times are tough. So for me, escaping into books made that easier for me, but I appreciate that's not going to be the case for everyone. So don't be too hard on yourselves if you didn't read that many books over lockdown, because very few people did. I just have managed to avoid loads of work by reading instead. I hope it's nice and sunny where you are. I hope you're having a nice day, and I'll see you next time.